Thought about these verses out of Ephesians chapter 2, hearing that song. The ground began to shake and I began to breathe. And Ephesians chapter 2 says, you were dead in your trespasses and sins. I was a dead man walking. I might have been breathing in my lungs, but I was a dead man walking. Verse 4 says, but God. But God, who's rich in mercy because of His great love that He had for us, made us alive with the Messiah and breathed new life into our lungs. Even though we were dead in trespasses, then He says, you are saved by grace. I didn't deserve it, but I got it. Together with Christ, He has also raised us up and seated us in the heavenlies. As far as God is concerned, when He looks at Clayton Houchins, God sees Clayton Houchins seated in the heavenly places as if I am already there. That's good resurrection news, isn't it? Well, it's Easter Sunday, and I don't know if it's true for other pastors, but for me it's always difficult sometimes. It can often be difficult to know what to talk about on special occasions. What did I talk about last year at Easter? Or the year before that? If I went and pulled off that last year's sermon off the shelf and printed it out and re-preached it, would anybody remember? Would people say to me, that was a great message, Pastor, I've never heard that before? Last year I preached that same thing. Yeah, thank you. I'm glad it was impactful. And I'll just tell you that I just had 2 or 3 different themes in my mind of things I wanted to share. I wanted to talk about peace. Jesus said before He left, He told His disciples, peace I give to you. My peace I leave with you. My peace I give to you. And in my mind, this has kind of become my favorite picture of what it means to be a Christian now. I can just put my hands in my pockets and I can live in peace. The Bible tells me I don't have to worry about anything. And sometimes I turn on the news and I think, well, I think I ought to be worried about something. And Jesus said, my peace I give to you. I'll leave my peace with you. Don't let your hearts be troubled. You don't have to do that. I wanted to talk about resurrection power and talk about the great things that God has done in our little church this year. They're significant. April the 20th, 4 years ago yesterday, Israel Tedrick began his spiritual journey in his new life. Resurrection power. I hate to call your name, Norman, but this year he said to us at Christmas time, he said, I've had Christmas for the first time, I think he said, in 15 years because of resurrection power. Woo! 1 year ago to tomorrow, April the 22nd, Lori Ciota had a birthday. Oh wait, that's not such a great big thing. But on that same day, she changed her last name to Brock, the 1 year anniversary.
All right.
If you knew that whole story, that kind of feels like resurrection power. God doing something He can do, just taking loose threads and sewing them together to write a beautiful picture. On Friend Day under the tent in October, at the end of this service, a lady came down front and she said, I need to be saved, but I don't know how. And on that day, we shared with her how to become a Christian. She got saved that day and baptized a few weeks later with her son. Today, it takes 2 carloads for her to get everybody here at church. It's a true story. It's a true story. There's a lot of other stories that have happened in our church this year because of resurrection power, and we're just careful. We just take time to write those names and those events and those answers to prayer by resurrection power on our little pile of rocks, because we want to remember what God has done in our lives because of resurrection power. That's what I wanted to talk about, so I just talked about it. In the end, as I've done a bunch of times over the past 4 years, I was impressed to stay on script. We've been studying the book of Exodus in the Old Testament. It's happened a bunch of times, but I would say to you that I think that the Lord has surely aligned the message today with Easter Sunday. Exodus 12 is awfully appropriate for Easter because this chapter is directed at God's people of faith May I just say to you this morning that I'm primarily talking to Christians, the people of faith, because that's who Exodus 12 was primarily talking to. If you're here today and someone's invited you to church and you're not a Christian, may I ask you to just listen intently to see if the truth that I'm talking about resonates within your heart. We've been talking about the last few weeks about the Passover. You remember that the people of Israel, the children of Israel, went down. 70 people went down to Israel to Egypt because of famine. And over the next 430 years, they grew to be a big nation, 600,000 men, plus wives and children, probably 2.5 million people in Egypt. They wanted to leave and be set free. And God called this man named Moses from the Old Testament and said, Moses, I want you used to live in Egypt, I want you to go back to Egypt, and I want you to lead the people of Israel out of Egypt. Moses said, well, I don't talk so good. I don't know if I can do that. God said, I'll be with you. So Moses goes before Pharaoh and says, Pharaoh, guess what? God told me to come and tell you to let my people go out of Egypt. And Pharaoh said, I don't think so. Moses said, but I'm telling you, God was real serious about it. So God did a series of judgments or plagues on the nation of Israel because Pharaoh wouldn't let God's people, Israel, leave out of Egypt. He finally did 9 of them. The score was 9-0. He finally came to the last one and he said, Moses, he said, here's what I want you to do. I want you to have a feast on the 14th day of the month. I want you to kill an animal, an innocent 1-year-old animal. And I want you to take the blood of that animal. I want you to tell every household in Israel to take that blood of that animal. And I want you to paint the doorposts and the lintel of your door with that blood. And at midnight on the 14th, I'm going to have an angel of God, the death angel. It's going to pass all over Egypt, and it's going to check every household. And every household that does not have the blood applied to the doorpost, I'm going to require the firstborn child of that family, of that home. Women, men, the firstborn of the livestock, everyone. But if you have the blood applied to the doorpost of your home, when the death angel passes, the death angel will pass over your home, and you will live. And I'm going to tell you what, Moses, the next morning, Pharaoh's going to call you in the middle of the night, and he's going to tell you, get out of here. And in Exodus chapter 12, that's where we just finished. The people of Israel were just told, get out of Egypt. And they took the first 25-mile journey from the little town of Ramesses to Succoth. It's about 25 miles. It would be like walking on day 1 from here to Greenville. 2.5 million people. And with that, we have the picture of the Passover. And I want us to look at three different little passages that have to do with the Passover today. The Passover then and now. The first one is we're still back in the book of Exodus chapter 12. At the end of the chapter, verse 43. The Lord said to Moses and Aaron, this is the statute of the Passover. Moses, you all have just now left Egypt. You just had the Passover. But I want this to become a statute. Now, what's a statute? It's like a law. It's like a rule. The statute of limitations or the South Carolina Code of Laws have statutes in it. This is a law. I'm going to write a law. Interestingly, this is only the second time in Exodus chapter 12 where the word statute appears. The first one is in Abraham. God said, I'm choosing Abraham to be my servant because he obeyed my commands and my statutes. We don't see that word statute again until Exodus chapter 12, and we've seen it 4 times here. This is a law. This is the first rule. It's like this was the first commandment. The first commandment that I'm giving is I want you every single year to celebrate the Passover. I'll give you the first little principle. Deliverance and freedom requires remembrance and celebration. God said, I've delivered you and set you free. I want you to celebrate this every single year, and I want you to remember it. It's like the first rule he ever made was, thou shalt celebrate thy deliverance on the day when God did set thee free. That's Clayton's King James Version. Deliverance and freedom requires remembrance and celebration. So here we are on Easter Sunday morning. We're remembering and we're celebrating, are we not? Frankly, that's the reason we're compiling a pile of rocks, so we can remember and celebrate and not forget. God's saying, on this day I set you free and delivered you from the Egyptians. Do not fail to remember and celebrate this day. So we'll probably just have Easter service next Sunday too, same time, same place. Well, hopefully not the same place, thank you, Jay. Hopefully they're attend. Now, for just a couple of minutes, may I ask you to go deep with me in some of those Old Testament rules and regulations that sometimes we're tempted to get bogged down on and cause us to say, I just don't get it. So first, let me just tell you that a covenant, remind you, a covenant is a contract between two parties. In this case, it's a contract between God Himself and the people of Israel. Why the people of Israel? Was it because they were good or worthy or deserved it? No, it was not. The nation of Israel was and is today in 2019 the covenant people of God because of their father Abraham, with whom God made that first covenant. God said, Abraham, the children of Israel are direct descendants from Abraham. God said, Abraham, I will bless you because of your faith, and I will bless all of your descendants. If you look on the map today, Israel's just a tiny little pinpoint of the world, but it is the center stage of the world's activities. Why? Because Israel always has been and always will be God's chosen people, because God gets to choose what He wants. And He chose the nation of Israel because of Abraham's faith. And so this Passover statute was specifically for God's covenant people, Israel, the descendants of Abraham. And remember this, please, from Genesis chapter 12, when God called Abraham, circumcision was the requirement on all of Israel to show that they were included as God's covenant people. Circumcision was the external sign that I want to sign up and be part of God's covenant people. It had to be done. And so let me give you point number 2. Deliverance and freedom requires commitment and identification. Look at the verse 43. The Lord said to Moses, this is the statute of the Passover, no foreigner may eat it. A foreigner outside was not identified with God's covenant people. Okay, how do you identify yourself with the family? Verse 44, if any man has a slave, but any slave a man has purchased, may eat it after you've circumcised him. So there's a way, if you're not born in the bloodline of Israel, there's a way to get in. You've just got to do this identification through circumcision to where you say, I am choosing to identify myself with the people of God, the God's covenant people. So even if you weren't born into the family, you can get into the family through this covenant rite of circumcision. Verse 45. A temporary resident or hired hand may not eat the Passover. Somebody who's just passing through doesn't qualify. Verse 46, it's to be eaten in one house. You may not take any of the meat out of the house, and you may not break any of its bones. This is a family event of celebration. No takeout orders, no to-go boxes. This is to be eaten in one house. It's a solemn celebration because there was a sacrifice involved. A little lamb or a little goat an innocent lamb or goat had to die. And we had Charlie the goat up here the other morning. The Glover goat, Charlie. Is that his name? We got it, all right. The Glover goat, Charlie, we had him here symbolically to represent. He's like a pet, a wonderful animal. He was an innocent animal, but a sacrifice had to die so that there was blood. It's a solemn celebration. It's like the 4th of July or Veterans Day. We celebrate those every year, don't we? But we're keenly aware that we're able to celebrate those because of the sacrifice of our veterans. That's right. We are free. You may not break any of its bones, it says in verse 46. Let me just go ahead and give you a hint. Remember that happened when Jesus was on the cross. Usually when you were crucified, to make sure you went ahead and hurried up and died, the soldiers would break your legs so you couldn't pull yourself up to grab breath. But the Bible said that no bones would be broken, and so Jesus was already dead. And we saw that in the picture a few minutes ago. The soldier took a spear and shoved it up in his side, and all of the liquids came out. He didn't have to have his bones broken. That was a foreshadowing of this verse right here. Verse 47, the whole community of Israel must celebrate it. If you're a part of the community, don't miss it. Verse 48, if a foreigner resides with you and wants to celebrate the Lord's Passover, every male in his house must be circumcised, and then he may participate. He will become like a native of the land. He'll be like one of us. But no uncircumcised person may eat it. Remember the point here that I gave you, that deliverance and freedom requires commitment and identification. I can't just show up and celebrate and be all excited about it without remembering that a sacrifice was involved and it requires something of me. Verse 49, the same law will apply to both the native and the foreigner who resides among you. Freedom isn't free. It required the sacrifice of something. Freedom in America is not free. It required the sacrifice. In this case, it was an innocent animal. God is saying you can't just cash in on the deliverance and freedom without also including the commitment and identification. He's saying, you know what? I commit my life to this. I want to publicly identify with that. And today, we don't have the rite of circumcision as part of that. Today, we have baptism of that as our outward identification, that I am identifying with the people of God. Today, baptism is that commitment. Deliverance and freedom requires remembrance and celebration, so we do it every year. It requires commitment and identification. I'm committed to this. I want to identify that. Thirdly, deliverance and freedom requires obedience and submission. Verse 50, then all the Israelites did this. They did just as the Lord had commanded Moses and Aaron. Don't miss it, God's saying. Don't stop celebrating it. Don't forget about the sacrifice was made. Don't forget about who you are. So on that historic day, verse 51, on that day, the Lord brought the Israelites out of the land of Egypt according to their divisions. Those people had been enslaved in bondage to Pharaoh in Egypt for their entire lives. These people, they'd been there for 430 years. All of the people were there. They'd been enslaved into bondage. For the first time ever in their lives, they were set free. They were free because God had set them free. That now, Exodus chapter 12, we're done with it. That is the end of the first Passover. We've seen it mentioned here in Exodus 12. In total, this mandatory celebration is mentioned 46 times in the Old Testament and 27 times more in the New Testament. Let me ask you a question. If you had been there that night and you had seen that and you had left Egypt, why would you ever stop celebrating that incredible event in your life? You were there firsthand. Why would you ever stop celebrating that? Well, jump ahead hundreds of years later to 2 Kings chapter 23. Josiah was one of the good kings in the land of Israel. Hundreds of years later, in a very low time of spiritual depravity, look what Josiah the king did. Verse 21, the king commanded all the people, keep the Passover of the Lord your God as it is written in the book of the covenant. Verse 22, no such Passover had ever been kept from the time of the judges who judged Israel through the entire time of the kings of Israel and Judah. For hundreds of years, they just decided that they were going to stop celebrating Passover. For hundreds of years. And this righteous King Josiah said, nope, we're going to go back and do exactly what God told us to do in the book of the covenant that was written by Moses. Verse 23, in the 18th year of King Josiah, the Passover was observed to the Lord in Jerusalem. Hundreds of years of not celebrating or remembering. They just took a vacation from it. They decided it wasn't important. It wasn't long lived, this Josiah, this revival under Josiah. Because of their disobedience to God, you remember that Israel was drug off into exile. Amazingly, 70 years later, they were able to come back. In Ezra 6:19 tells us the exiles observed the Passover on the 14th day of the first month. Why did they stop observing this incredible celebration of deliverance and freedom? Why would they do that? Now, I don't know, but from that point on, once they finally came out of exile, the nation of Israel apparently consistently celebrated the Passover every single year after that. And not just the Passover, but other feasts and festivals. And so when Jesus came to our world about 2,000 years ago, he was born as a Jew, as an Israelite. He and his family celebrated the Passover as well. They remembered what had happened 1,500 years earlier. But the last Passover, this is the second picture. We're finished with the first picture in Exodus 12. The second picture is in Matthew chapter 26. This last Passover of Jesus' life was different. Look at this, verses 1 and 2. When Jesus had finished saying all of this, what did he say? He just preached this beautiful sermon back in chapter 25. I encourage you to go back and read that. When Jesus had finished saying all these things, he told his disciples, you know that the Passover takes place after 2 days from now. And on that day, the Son of Man will be handed over to be crucified. In that moment for us, Jesus himself connected his life and his death on the cross. He connected that for us back to the Passover that happened in Exodus chapter 12. He did that for us in those two verses. Why? Because the entire Old Testament, sometimes it gets lost on us, but the entire Old Testament is really nothing but God drawing a picture, a foreshadowing, telling us the story about what was to come with his son Jesus. A few verses later, still in Matthew chapter 26, this happens to be on Thursday evening. We celebrate that now as Maundy Thursday. We had a great meeting with the senior adults here that just happened the other night. We had a great meeting and a great discussion about Maundy Thursday and the significance of that. These verses happened on that Thursday evening. On the first day of unleavened bread was a 7-day festival. It started right here with Passover. That means they ate bread without any yeast in it. How boring is that? On the first day of unleavened bread, the disciples came to Jesus and asked us, Jesus, where do you want us to prepare the Passover so that you made it? Jesus gave them these specific directions. You remember, go into the city and tell a certain man, tell him the teacher says, my time is near. I am celebrating the Passover at your place with my disciples. So the disciples did as Jesus had directed them and prepared the Passover. When evening came on Thursday evening, he was reclining at the table with the 12. And there we have the first Lord's Supper. Just like the Passover, that night was the first commemoration and celebration of the new Passover. The new covenant. And you know what? They had a blank stare on their face. The disciples did not get it. Jesus breaks the bread and passes it around, said, this is my body broken for you. And they look at it like one another like, what is he talking about? Holds up the wine and says, this is the blood of my covenant given for you, poured out for you. And the disciples were thinking, what is he talking about? That's not what the Passover was. There's verses here in verses 26 through 28. They were eating. Jesus took bread and blessed it and gave it to the disciples and said, take and eat, this is my body. Then he took a cup, and after giving thanks, he gave it to them and said, drink from it, all of you. For this is my blood that establishes the new covenant, the new contract. It's shed for many for the forgiveness of sins. And you know what? They didn't get it. It didn't make sense at all. Jesus said, what is about to happen represents the end of that old covenant. The old Passover is gone. What's about to happen now represents the new covenant, the New Testament, the new Passover. I'm taking the old rules and all of the old regulations, and Colossians would tell us, Brother Joe, that Jesus took those ordinances, those rules and regulations, and he nailed them to the cross. Gone are all those rules and regulations. This is a new covenant that I'm establishing with my blood. This new covenant still involves a spotless lamb. Remember, John the Baptist was baptizing people. There's a line, just baptizing as fast as he could. And he looks up on the bank one day, and there comes Jesus walking to him. And John chapter 1 tells us this, that whenever John stopped and he looked up, the next day John saw Jesus coming toward him and said, "There is the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world." The Old Testament lamb or goat that had to be sacrificed, they had to do that every year after year after year after year, because it was just the blood of a lamb or a goat. But John said, "There's the Lamb of God, and He's going to take the sin of the entire world away." The lamb would be completely burnt up in the Old Covenant. Jesus' body would be completely broken. That was represented by the bread. No broken bones, though. I just told you that the soldier did not need to break Jesus' bones because he was already dead. Just like in Exodus 12, it would be blood that established the covenant or the contract. It was blood that had to be painted over the door. And today it is the blood of Jesus that has to be painted over the door of my heart. That's the new covenant. All of the old rules and regulations are shot out the window. That's why we can stand up here and say, "I'm free. I'm free from the guilt of the past. I'm free from the rules and the laws and the regulations." Jesus' blood, when it dripped out on the ground, dried up and rotted in the dust, it paid the penalty for me in full. This time the blood would have to be applied not to the door of a home, but to the door of a heart. Jesus would be the new Passover lamb. God had instituted a Passover lamb way back in the Old Testament. And it was the blood that was there that formed the line of demarcation. If you're on this side of the line and you have a blood applied to the doorpost of your home, then you will be saved. If you're on this side of the line and you have not had the blood of the blood applied to your doorpost, then the death angel would pass over and God would bring judgment. Today, it's the blood of Jesus that is the line of demarcation between whether Clayton Houchins ever has a chance to make it into God's presence or not. It is the line, the blood of Jesus. It is the line of demarcation. It's really, Jesus made it real simple. For God so loved the world that He gave His only begotten Son, that whosoever would just simply believe in Him would not perish but have eternal life. It's the line of demarcation. In the New Testament, God substituted that old Passover lamb with the new Passover lamb, and it happened to be His very own Son. Today we celebrate, on this Easter Sunday, we celebrate deliverance and freedom. That's the reason we celebrate it every year. Today it's the greatest day of the year because it was the greatest day in all of human history. No other day comes close. We were delivered from what? Well, what's going on in your life? From sin and from death and from hopelessness and from fear and from discouragement and from worry and anxiety. Jesus carried every bit of that away when He died on the cross. So I can walk around with my hands in my pockets. I don't always do it. Sometimes I get real anxious and real worried whenever I look at what's going on in the world, but God says, "I took that away." You don't have to do it. You don't have to carry that. Jesus had to die so that you and I might live. And He did. Why? Because God so loved the world. So what did it look like going forward? We looked at two pictures. One in Exodus chapter 12. One whenever the Passover was first created in Matthew chapter 26. How about the third one? A few short decades later, the Apostle Paul would write some words to a church at Corinth. He'd started the church. He'd been there, and he was a missionary, and he started the church, and he left. He'd been there for about a year and a half, and he left, and years later he wrote back to that church. We have two letters, 1 Corinthians and 2 Corinthians. There was apparently at least a third letter that we'll see here in just a second. 1 Corinthians chapter 5. Verse 6 says, "Your boasting is not good." Apparently something was happened and they were boasting. They were proud about it in the church. Don't you know that a little leaven permeates the whole batch? Leaven is yeast. It's what we put in bread. And throughout the Bible, the word yeast or leaven, it represents sin. There's gotten to be some sin in the camp in your church. Your boasting is not good. Then Paul kind of drops the hammer in verse 7. He says, "Clean out the old yeast, so that you can be a new batch. Clean out the old stuff. Clean out the sin from among you, from within your heart. Clean out the old batch so that you can be a new batch. And here it is. For you are indeed unleavened. For Christ our Passover has been sacrificed. You are indeed unleavened. Do you know what that means? That means that when I trusted Jesus Christ as my personal Savior, God declared me righteous. He declared it. Done. Finished. Sometimes Clayton doesn't act that way. Sometimes Clayton doesn't act as though he is righteous. But God has declared me righteous, unleavened, pure, whole, and complete. You've been declared that because Christ, our Passover, has been sacrificed. You need to clean out the old stuff. You're unleavened. You are unleavened. You need to act unleavened. If there was ever any doubt whether the Passover in Exodus 12 was a foreshadowing, Paul just resolved it for us right there. Christ, our Passover, has been sacrificed. He says in verse 8, therefore let us observe the feast, not with the old yeast or with the yeast of malice and evil, but with the unleavened bread of sincerity and truth. Whenever he says, let us observe the feast, what do you think he's talking about? He's talking about the Lord's Supper. When we get together and we celebrate now the Lord's Supper in commemoration of Christ, our Passover, he says, let's do it with, not with the yeast or the sin of malice or evil within our hearts, but man, we need to clean our hearts out so that we celebrate the Passover with sincerity, open hearts, with truth. Right in the same chapter, let me just go back. That was those were verses 6 through 8. And I know it's Easter and it's a great time of celebration, but Paul talks about this Christ our Passover. What a beautiful picture. But I don't want to just pull this one verse out. I want you to just see the context in which these verses were written. Chapter 5, verse 1. Are you ready? I know it's Easter time and a great celebration, but let's consider this context. It is widely reported that there is sexual immorality among you. And the kind of sexual immorality that is not even tolerated among the Gentiles. A man is living with his father's wife. Wow, what a despicable behavior that is. Happening in this church in Corinth that Paul started. In the same context as this beautiful picture of Christ the Passover. Verse 2, you're inflated with pride instead of filled with grief, so that he who has committed the act might be removed from your congregation. It's right here in your congregation. This immorality is happening right here among you. There is leaven in the camp. There is sin. There is bread in the camp. There's sin in the bread in the camp. With those points I made earlier about this celebrating this event, deliverance and freedom requires remembrance and celebration. It requires commitment and identification. And it also requires obedience and submission. Right there in this beautiful picture about Christ our Passover, Paul says there's sin in the camp. Paul talks about that immoral behavior in the first few verses of chapter 5. Then he gives us this beautiful picture of Christ our Passover in verses 6 through 8. And verse 9, he goes right back at it. Verse 9, I wrote to you in a letter, that was at least the third letter that Paul wrote. I wrote to you in a letter not to associate with sexually immoral people. He calls out sexual immorality. By the way, the Greek word there is the word porneia, from which we get pornography. In the New Testament, the word porneia, it was a general term. It was talked about any behavior that is in violation of God's standard on the issue of human sexuality. I wrote to you in a letter not to associate with sexually immoral people, but fasten your seatbelts. Verse 10. I did not mean the immoral people of this world or the greedy and swindlers or idolaters. Otherwise, you'd have to leave the world. I'm not talking about those people out there. Because those people out there, they've never experienced Christ our Passover. They've never experienced the forgiveness and the freedom that comes. I'm not talking about them out there because you know what? Those behaviors are behaviors that we would expect from somebody out there. Those are the behaviors that we would expect from somebody who's never been set free and their sins forgiven by the blood of Jesus. I didn't mean to put immoral people of this world or the greedy or swindlers. Otherwise, you have to leave the world. Why? Because they're everywhere. I'm not talking about them. May I just say to you in church this morning, it is easy for us in here often to throw the darts at the people out there. We would say, if those people out there would just clean their act up, the world would be a better place. And Paul said, I'm not talking about those people out there. Verse 11, but now I'm writing you not to associate with anyone who claims to be a believer. Wow. Someone who said, I want to identify myself with Jesus. I want to ask God to forgive me. I want Him to declare me righteous. And Paul says, I'm now talking to those people who claim to be a believer. I'm writing to you, don't associate with someone who claims to be a believer who is sexually immoral or greedy, an idolater, or verbally abusive, a drunkard, or a swindler. Don't even eat with such a person. Goodness gracious. Right there in the middle of that passage, that beautiful passage about what Jesus has done for Clayton, Paul says, Clayton, you got to make sure there's no leaven in the camp. I began the message this morning by saying that it was for people who call themselves Christians. Because if somebody hasn't had the wonderful, amazing gift of trusting Jesus as their Savior, we expect something different from them. But for those of us on Easter Sunday who have made a commitment to Jesus Christ, Paul would say you need to just do a little checkup and make sure there's no leaven in the camp. It's quite a list, isn't it, happening in this church. Sexually immoral. He's not talking to the folks out there, he's talking to us in here. Greedy is the second one. May I ask you, do your giving habits indicate that you are greedy or that you are generous? Idolater, if you were to monitor the amount of time that you spend and that I spend idolizing other people, athletes and musicians and celebrities and maybe even a spouse or a child, versus the amount of time I spend worshiping Christ, our Passover, who died for me and forgave me and delivered me and set me free, would Paul consider Clayton to be a worshiper of God or an idolater? The next one is verbally abusive. Really, Paul? You had to put that in the Bible? That opens up a whole can of thoughts, doesn't it? Drunkard. That behavior simply doesn't belong in the church of Christ, our Passover. Swindler, that means ill-gotten gain. The King James uses the word extortion here. You know what Paul is saying? He's saying, church, you have applied the precious blood of Christ to your life. He's asking, hey, have you made that commitment? Have you identified yourself with Him? Are you here on Easter Sunday 2019 to celebrate Christ our Passover? And then Paul might ask us, are you involved in sexual immorality? Are you greedy? Are you sometimes worshiping something else besides God? How's your language? Are you living soberly? Are you living with integrity? Paul goes on to tell us in verses 11, 12, he basically says, I don't have time to be judging people out there. We got to be looking internal. We got to be making sure that our hearts and lives are clean. I will tell you honestly, this is not the message that I had on my heart. I want to talk about real great resurrection power, testimony about what God's done in my life. But I'm going to tell you that I believe that it's the message that God wanted for all of us to hear. Easter is a time of great celebration, but it isn't to be taken lightly. Easter comes to us, this great celebration of resurrection, it comes to us at a great cost. It cost God the life and the blood of His very own boy, His own Son, Jesus. I'm reminded of the last verse of the song, When I Survey the Wondrous Cross. I've got the words, I think, here. If the whole realm of nature was mine, if I owned the whole world to give to God, were the whole realm of nature mine, that would be a present far too small to give me. Love this amazing, love this divine man, my soul and my life. You bow your heads.